in the car, Jones. We're getting you drunk. Not there, not a taxi service.
Pubs. After a tough week at work, nothing quite hits the spot like a trip down to the boozer for a crisp pint of lager. Nothing quite sizzles the senses like a bready Guinness, maybe an overly sugary cider. And if you're feeling particularly done with the universe, there's always a nice, strong spirit to wipe your mind of the day's stresses. Pubs, short for public houses, are a fundamental aspect in British culture and have been for centuries. No matter where you go in the United Kingdom, you can be certain that you're never more than a 5-minute walk from somebody's local. Whether you're in the centre of a city or the middle of absolutely nowhere, pubs are an absolute staple of what it means to be British. For many in the UK, a boozer is where a person experiences the best and worst memories of their lives. It's where we meet our friends and catch up. It's where we make new friends whilst vomiting into a toilet, and then never see them again. It's where we make plans that we almost certainly will never carry out. It's where we unwind after a hard week, or get wound up and kicked out by the bouncer. Alcohol can be a contributing factor to some of our best and worst decisions. The pub is where we partake in a variety of activities: drinking, eating, drinking, pub quizzes, drinking, terrible karaoke, drinking, playing pool, playing darts, discussing important issues such as politics or football, whining about our significant others, complaining about the weather, and of course, more drinking. This has been the case for centuries, but sadly, in the past 2 decades or so, pubs have seen a rapid decline in the UK. That being said, across Britain, there are still tens of thousands of pubs still open and serving that delightful, rewarding pint that we all crave. But how did this jovial tradition, these pillars of our communities, begin? In today's video, Connor Jones's 2003 Nissan Almera Special Edition got stolen, so he is going to get blackout drunk as we visit some nearby boozers. Meanwhile, I will assume the role of designated driver, and together we are going to be exploring the history of pubs. Before we proceed with too much self-destructive behaviour, let's actually get into the history. Today's history lesson dates back roughly 2,000 years ago. The native alcoholic beverage of Britain prior to the Roman Empire's arrival was ale. The construction of a network of Roman roads led to the establishment of shops, known as tabernae, which translates from Latin to shops, believe it or not. A taberna would be an epicenter for commerce and would typically have a single room shop utilised as a domestic dwelling where cooked food and wine would be served. These tabernae were commonplace across the Roman Empire and before it likely ancient Greece. However, it's believed the Romans would greatly increase their numbers as they expanded into the Mediterranean. As the Roman Empire expanded, tabernae would be established within indoor markets and anywhere else with frequent commerce. They would often feature wide doorways and be open to the street. They wouldn't exclusively function for the purpose of selling wine and food, but rather as structures that housed all kinds of sales, from luxury and exotic items to a simple scoff to keep a browser fed. The tabernae present in the British Isles would adapt to provide locals with ale, and the singular word taberna would likely be distorted, marking the origins of the name tavern. The Romans would leave Britain in the early 5th century, and these places would effectively be left behind. Along with it, the infrastructure, and in failing that, the idea to establish alehouses or taverns. Easily accessed shelter along main roads to provide food and drink to travellers and locals alike. Over the next few centuries, these taverns would see the invading Angles, Saxons and Scandinavians, to name a few, adapting to suit the needs of the varying cultures of their clientele. Anglo-Saxons would establish these alehouses, and they would quickly become a popular meeting location for folk to socialise and discuss problems and solutions within their respective communities. These taverns would become integral to travel across the British Isles. Shelter, food and drink would never go amiss along trade routes. Pilgrims, merchants and other travellers of all kinds would utilise the hospitality to their advantage along their journeys. Taverns would also slowly develop into inns, providing a place for guests to stay the night, safe and sound. Alehouses or taverns would develop a political significance too, with many laws, rules and discussions dedicated specifically to their very existence, as their consistency over the centuries granted them power over the time's economy. For example, in the mid-10th century, Anglo-Saxon King Edgar of England would supposedly attempt to impose limitations on how many alehouses any one village could contain, as well as supposedly passing a law known as the Peg, a measure that restricted the amount of alcoholic beverages any one individual could consume. Ethelred the Unready, king of the English in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, would even impose a fine for breaching the peace at alehouse meetings. They would become almost sacred sites in their own right. Conflict was to be left at the door, and all that was found within was peace, alcohol, and conversation. And with that, it's time to stop at a pub so Connor can have his first drink. But not me, I'm a good boy, I'm driving. You see, Connor? This is how you stop your car getting nicked.
Yeah, you're a bit of a bell engine.
See, now they can't steer it if they wanted to, see?
This is a pub, does very nice beer and food.
This pub was the Owd Betts Pub, located just outside of Rochdale in Lancashire. Or is it Greater Manchester now? I guess it really depends on who you ask, but they serve some nice pints and also some nice food.
I don't need to burp anymore. Oh, pathetic.
So while Connor sleeps off his one Guinness, let's crack on with the history. Into the Middle Ages, taverns or alehouses were on the cusp of evolution once again. Before this time, travellers seeking refuge would typically have to seek accommodation at a monastery. However, over the next few centuries, the demand for hospitality to this extent grew, alongside the increase in pilgrims and travelling merchants. Now, taverns could also function as inns, or what we might know today as a hotel, or more accurately, a bed and breakfast. Not only did taverns serve food and drink, but they could also provide a bed for a weary traveller to rest, safe from the dangers of the outdoors. It's also believed that at one point or another, inns would find themselves having some form of military purpose too. Inns could function as recruitment centres, driving up enlistment into armed service. Many open today claim to have served this purpose, however it's unclear if these pubs even existed at the times they claim to have done so. Regardless, it's likely that popular attractions within communities were potentially ideal staging grounds for recruitments, especially when looking for what's effectively cannon fodder. Couple that with the fact that everybody was sloshed on ale, potentially impressionable and in an impulsive and reckless mood. Alcohol isn't exactly known to lead to rational decision making. Taking advantage in that during a time where it was allowed was simply good maths. Moving on from that, however, taverns were not exclusive to England or even the British Isles, but their purpose as refuge for travellers and crucial aspects of the economies they were a part of spanned more or less the entirety of Europe. France exhibited taverns and inns from as far back as the early 1300s. They would function as major attractions for evening dining out. They would offer food and drink. Their main function was to serve wine, a drink so heavily revered by the French that children would drink it with their dinners at school up until recently. French taverns and inns would evolve into cabarets, where in-house entertainment would set these places apart from the rest of Europe. Germany today is well known for its passionate and well-made beer, so it's no surprise that the Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed what we know today as Germany, saw drinking as an act of social status. However, the region followed well-structured social norms regarding it, so drinking was tolerated provided men upheld their households and followed tavern rules. Women considered to be respectable were not allowed inside taverns unless accompanied by their husbands, and drunk women was seldom tolerated. However, women could impose control over their spouse's drinking habits should they get out of hand, and provided those rules were followed, it was respected. And then the Scandinavians loved to drink to excess. Need I say more? Of course, taverns, or tavern equivalents, would be popular establishments there. The recurring theme is almost every region of Europe had some form of tavern-like business model, social structures and societal norms. Drinking in public with your pals was always going to be more jovial than drinking alone, especially in a time before Twitter and televised sports. The tavern would also make its way to North America, but we're not quite there yet. Back in England, the significance of inns led to the formation of a hostlers guild in London in the mid-15th century. This guild would evolve into the Worshipful Company of Innholders and functioned as a traders' association for hostlers. And then alehouses, taverns and inns would become collectively known as public houses around the time of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, likely under the reign of King Henry VII. This name would be shortened to pub, a name that has become iconic in the eyes, ears, hearts, stomachs, brains, nervous systems, livers and pancreas of the British public ever since. It's at this point that the pub, on paper at least, was officially born. But we're still a far cry from pubs as we know them today. Anyway, before we get to that, it's time to stop off at our next pub, the Red Lion, located in Hawkshaw, because Jones needs another pint.
It's at Red Lion. Nice boozer, nice ale, nice atmosphere, nice food.
Clearly, Jones is taking the loss of his car quite hard.
Go cockeyed again.
Somebody should really stage an intervention before this gets messy, but I'm not his mum, so I don't really give a
I think we should move onwards.
And that we most certainly will. The expansion of public houses, taverns, inns or alehouses, whichever name takes your fancy, embedded itself in Britain's economy, due to beers and ale being safer to consume than the standard drinking water of the times, which was quite dirty and rife with disease. Under those circumstances, it is understandable why the nation simply couldn't get enough of them. The 15th century would also see the dawn of licensing laws. Henry VII passed an act against vagabonds and beggars in 1496, empowering justices of the peace to enforce that alehouses were registered and licensed. These taverns or old pubs would provide food and lodging, as well as stabling and feed for horses. Their communal dining areas were popular settings for local town meetings. They were popping up everywhere. Many were simply houses to begin with that had spare rooms and spare beds. Unlike today, where you could walk straight into a pub or an inn, an innkeeper would have to open the door for guests and decide who they would accommodate. The prospective guest would need to convince the owner to grant them a bed for the night. However, some areas, specifically certain English townships, would form laws dictating that innkeepers do their utmost to provide all visitors with a bed or a bev, whichever they needed. Say in, bro, got any nicotine? How do you get in there then? Like, what's that about? Like, how do you manage it? What are your secrets? That's an unruly beast right there. Shall we go and say hello to it, or will it kill us? He wants to scrap. I can tell he's sizing us up. He's like, I'm gonna go do you in. A key aspect to the evolution of the inn was its atmosphere. An inn, tavern or pub would most commonly be a dimly lit establishment due to the use of tallow candles. Low lighting is always a cosy feeling, and a lot of places, even today, have remained faithful to that archetype of aesthetics. Sanitation was a different issue. Most inns used a barrel as a toilet, and it would be emptied every morning. Beds would be used for more than one traveller at a time. Sometimes several could slide into one bed for the night, as strange as that might be today. But this was a time before sanitation and privacy were really valued as highly as they are in modern society. I know I wouldn't want to share a bed with this clown, so having to do so with strangers would send me over the edge. Due to the volume of travellers, irregular taverns and public houses would come and go, but inns would see a much more consistent clientele. Thus, it wasn't long before inns would easily be identified as older and grander establishments. Today the distinction is no longer formal, and many pubs can be seen today sporting the word inn in their names. Once upon a time, these places may have functioned as coaching inns, or maybe it's just used in jest to invite passers-by inside, to welcome them in. By the late 16th century, it is estimated that roughly 20,000 public houses encompassing various forms existed in England and Wales. The hospitality industry was booming across the kingdom, as it was always destined to do so. They were pillars of their respective communities. A boom in the industry was a given. So with all that said, it's time to go for our next drink, because if we allow Jones to become sober again, he'll start talking about trains. And believe me, you don't want that. So, we're in Burrs Country Park in Bury. A lovely place to take in some scenery, if that's your thing. Or you could just be daft like Connor and film a heron taking a dump. Anyway, the reason why we came here is for the pub at the centre of this lovely park. Well, technically not the centre, but you get the picture I'm trying to paint. That pub is, of course, the Brown Cow. They do lovely pints and food, and the place is always full of dogs. Many pubs in the UK are dog friendly. I wouldn't say all of them are, but it certainly isn't uncommon. The only reason I mention this really is so that we can all enjoy some lovely dog stock footage together. I'm sure you appreciate it if you love dogs as much as I do. I would use footage of my own dog, but sadly, he's going to be dead for the foreseeable future. Man, that was heavy. Maybe I need a drink. Don't remind me. Of course, then we had to go for an evening walk to ensure that Connor didn't die from moderate alcohol consumption, because that's a concern.
He did that with that extra bit of panetta. Oh, I'm dead. Right, this is a modern art installation. Connor Jones proving that the giant mouse trap does indeed not work.
There's no cheese on this fucker.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to catch, but the contraption's faulty, so maybe they've just left it.
It says picnic area on it.
The first pub or tavern established in colonial America opened in the early 17th century. Colonial Americans had an affinity for a variety of distilled spirits, but their poison of choice was rum. Throughout most of New England, taverns among the colonies were referred to as ordinaries to begin with. Ordinaries were influential in development of new settlements, functioning as communal gathering locations of choice. Taverns in North America would also function for more purposes than just serving alcohol and providing a social space, due to the infrastructure's infancy, being used as courtrooms, churches, trading posts and post offices, to name a few of their functions. The further out a tavern was from the established settlements, the more roles it undertook, with those on the cusp of the frontier serving the purpose of being a trading post for those who were venturing forth to settle deeper into what was unknown territory at that time. Colonial taverns would typically consist of two-storey log cabins, with 2 rooms to a floor. The ground floor would function as the public space and bar, and the upper floor was used for bedrooms. Due to the circumstances of their establishment, they'd become pretty much their own thing off the bat. Back in Britain in the 18th century, the consumption of gin would spike, as an alternative to French brandy during a time of secular and religious turmoil between Britain and France, specifically in the major cities. With brandy imports being restricted, gin was popular amongst the poor because it was cheap. It was also less taxable, and the treasury took a hit, beginning the gin craze. Parliament would pass several major acts in an attempt to curb the consumption of gin. Now, I don't understand much about the gin craze, but if I look at my mum for long enough I get a pretty good idea. However, this problem was resolved by the 1750s, which means we get to move on to the birth of the pub as we know it today. Yes, everything up until this point has been convoluted pre-context. You're welcome. The concept of the modern pub would begin to develop in the 19th century, with the rapid developments of infrastructure during the Industrial Revolution, which saw small towns become big cities, and vast rises in local populations. Prior to this, alehouses were common along rural roads, which were for the most part off the beaten path. Typically, the only beverages available at old pubs would be beer, often brewed by the owner of the establishment themselves. However, under the massive expansion of the Industrial Revolution and the demand for beer and places to house social engagement, many regions would be transformed, and as a result, many out-of-the-way pubs found themselves now as central community hubs, with a large repertoire of regulars and competition to contend with. With this demand, these old rural pubs needed to evolve into more urban houses. Acquiring alcoholic beverages from third parties would become a must to keep up with the demand. And by the mid-19th century, pubs would become purpose-built, which allowed pubs to stand out from private houses, thus allowing these buildings to be instantly recognisable. This was the true birth of pubs as we know them today. As before, many pubs, taverns and inns evolved from what were simply residences. It was around this time when beer pumps began to emerge. Though originally invented by Dutchman John Lofting in the late 17th century, beer engines only really began to gain popularity going into the 19th century. This innovation allowed a larger number of customers to be served in a shorter time frame, allowing for business to accelerate and profits to be maximised. This John Lofting character would also invent and patent fire hoses and fire engines. Between fighting fires and creating a swifter means for alcohol to be served, I think it's fair to say we're dealing with a man who has his priorities in order. For the working class, life during the Industrial Revolution was difficult, and large portions of workers' wages would be spent in these drinking establishments. Terrible living and working conditions led to very unhappy people, so rowdiness was fairly common when alcohol was added to the mix. But for many, the pub was still a home away from home. Towards the end of the 19th century, due to the increased competition to secure markets and by extension profits for specific products, breweries began to purchase local pubs, afterwards directly employing staff to operate them. This led to a change in how many pubs functioned and became known as the birth of the tied house system. By the end of the 19th century, roughly 90% of public houses in England were owned and managed by breweries, meaning the only means from here for these breweries to grow their own profits was to go to war with one another. Buyouts were commonplace and properties aggressively changed hands frequently. By the 1980s, only 6 large brewers remained in the UK, and they became known as the Big Six. The government would step in a ploy to increase the number of free houses in the UK, forcing big breweries to sell their tied houses via the beer orders in 1989. The supply of beer order of 1989 restricted the number of tied houses that a brewery could own in order to avoid the industry becoming monopolised through a lack of competition for consumers, though at this point it effectively was. The number of tied pubs a brewery could own was now limited to 2,000, which is still a significantly large number, and also required landlords to allow for guest beers to be sourced by tenants and not dictated by the landlords. This order would be lifted in 2003, by which time the market had significantly changed, with no one company dominating the beer industry. Which brings us nicely to the modern day. Exploring all of this history, it's immediately apparent why pubs have taken hold in British culture. They're everywhere. Easy establishments to find, ready to serve you a fine beverage to end the day, or to start it if it's match day. The pub is a staple of life in the British Isles. It's where communities truly come together. It's where friends meet. It's where one finds an almost never-ending supply of beer. It's a shame that the number of pubs are in decline now in the UK, with many more businesses struggling to make ends meet in wake of the pandemic and its lockdowns, and soaring costs to living. It is sad to see places where people once drank closing their doors for good, with the number of open pubs in the UK reaching record lows in the early months of 2022. In spite of this, there are still dozens of thousands of pubs with their doors wide open, serving pints to people across the country every day. It's estimated that a third of Britain's population visits a pub at least once a fortnight, which is far from an all-time high, but it's still an absurdly large number of people. The pub and its history is far from exclusive to England and the United Kingdom. Drinking establishments can be found all over the world, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. It's impossible to narrow down where the idea originated from to begin with, but today, even in decline, the pub is massively popular in the UK. In fact, it's not uncommon to see a pub right next to a pub. The benefits of the pub is perhaps the only thing most people in this country agree on. Provided you remember to drink within your limits, a pint down the pub can be a rewarding experience. So far we've explored the pub as a fundamental aspect in collective British culture. But it's not just a UK thing, and it would be criminal to pretend it is. Ireland has no shortage of pubs. Irish pubs have existed for roughly 1,000 years, with the country's oldest pub still open, believed to have been established in the 10th century. The Irish pub is famed for its cosy atmosphere, fulfilling drink and traditional music. Irish pubs pride themselves on professionalism but also informality. Big chain and brewery ownership is far less common, and their appeal is so great that it's not uncommon to find Irish-themed bars around the world. The pub is just as much a part of Ireland's social culture as it is in Britain. It's a place where people come together. The Irish pub has its own history, which may be worth its own video at some point, but you get the idea. It's not 100% exclusively a Britain thing. The pub is a pillar of a community, a local establishment where people always find themselves, whether they're regulars who know every other regular by name, or newcomers passing through or having a bev somewhere new to them. The pub is where everybody is welcome, unless you're a troublemaker who's been barred. As with everything, boozing does have its downsides, but hopefully the pub will be a part of our lives until the day we die. Thanks for watching this video, but please remember to drink responsibly.
Shouldn't your car be there?
Shit!